If they are less likely to budge on a particular issue, then they're indicating that that issue is more important to them. But if you ask them which issue is more important, they wouldn't tell you. For those people who see time as circular, as compared to those people who see time as linear. For example,
how or if the Chinese philosophy influenced the negotiation styles?
One is overall Confucianism and 知己知彼，百战不殆.
What's the one thing that people should stop doing immediately in order to avoid misunderstanding in cross-cultural negotiations?
Negotiation actually involves 3 domains. The first would be the substance. The second would be...
What next level tips or tricks do you use to prepare people for high-stake negotiations?
Is to treat it as...
Grace, we've worked together at HKU, but to all our viewers, could you tell us what is your expertise?
Hi, I'm Grace Xiao Ying Xie, Xiao Ying. I'm the principal lecturer in accounting and law in HKU Business School, and I'm also the program director in operations in HKU EMBA program. And I explore negotiation strategies that can help people to achieve their goals without jeopardizing their relationship.
Is it a fact or a myth that people negotiate differently across cultures?
Philip, cultures differ in the way people behave, in their decision-making styles, in their values. For example, culture differs in terms of how people understand time. For those people who see time as circular, as compared to those people who see time as linear, they might treat deadline, promptness, scheduling very differently.
Could you explain to our viewers what's the difference between circular perception of time and linear perception of time?
Linear time or perceived time, as terminology would be monochronic culture. They will see time as once it happens, it never come back anymore. Mm-hmm. So it is linear. Once it's passed, it's gone. Therefore, promptness is very important. Scheduling, once we already have an agenda or a schedule, it's better not to change. And then deadline, oftentimes, is binding. In comparison, for circular perception of time, what we call polychronic culture, for them, time comes back and go and comes back and go all the time. So it comes, it's circular. Mm-hmm. Therefore, promptness, the concept of that is comparatively loose. And then people think the schedule, deadline is flexible as well. So when negotiators have different concept of time, then when they're at the same negotiation table, then conflict might transpire because how late is considered as being late, right? Those from monochronic culture would expect a really on time, sharp, right, at that moment for you to appear at the negotiation. But maybe for the counterpart, to them, 30 minutes late is acceptable. Maybe 40 minutes late is acceptable, right? Same thing to delivery time, right, and execution of contract terms. And the change of deadline would be maybe more acceptable to one side of the story as compared to the other, right? And then also has to do with how we understand space. How do we understand our distance between each other when we negotiate, the size of the table, and the most particular commonly observed difference actually is in communication styles. So there's one dimension, we call it high context versus low context culture, where cultures differ in terms of how explicit we communicate. High context communicators, their communication styles are more implicit. So for them, a lot of informations are assumed. So it is not necessary to explain it explicitly or directly. In comparison, those people who come from low context culture, then they will believe that we need to explain everything clearly in the message. If we don't say it, it's not there. Now, we can think about, a very quick example would be expressing appreciation. So for high context culture members, especially between friends and family members, now, if you helped me, I don't feel obligated to say thank you because for this relationship, my appreciation is assumed. But how do I express thank you to you? I would help you in return in the future by reciprocation. And for low context culture member, appreciation needs to be expressed. So if you don't say thank you, if you don't say that you're grateful, you are appreciative, then the counterparty don't assume that you are appreciative.
Right.
Now, when we connect that to negotiation, we can see that for high context culture members, they probably don't like very explicit contract terms. They don't feel comfortable of list everything in details in the contract because they might think that hurt face because these are not necessary, right? Do you think that I don't understand those? But for low context cultural members, they might need to put everything that they believe that needs to be discussed in the contract term.
I understand it might be sometimes stereotyping or compartmentalization of people, but are you able to tell me a few examples of the cultures which are circular versus linear culture in terms of time?
So we can only talk about the central tendency, right? So there are always within culture variations, but a couple of very typical monochronic cultures. Germany is highly monochronic, and then Western European countries overall are monochronic. U.S. culture more on the monochronic side, and then for polychronic culture, Southeastern cultures, particularly more South India, is a typical polychronic culture. And then Mexico, Southern American cultures, a lot of them are polychronic culture as
And
well.
where do we put China and Hong Kong?
China is more along the line of somewhere in the middle, but toward polychronic. But like I would say, across the answer to many questions, China is a big country, and then there are a lot of within country, within culture variations. So knowing your counterpart, who they are, where they are from, what is their age group, which city do they come from, that might make a difference. And for high context and low context culture, Japanese culture, Korean culture, Chinese culture, very typical high context culture. For Chinese negotiators, you would expect very indirect way of expressing their offers and counteroffers and their interests, particularly the motivations behind what they're asking for. And oftentimes you don't get that right on the negotiation table. Low context cultures, overall Western cultures, overall are more along the line of low context, US being very typical low context
So
culture.
again, low context is very direct. High context is very indirect.
Explicit and indirect, and then you have to, express the meaning in the message, right? So in negotiation, we might see, for example, in a high context culture, they wouldn't say no right in your face, right to you directly. They might postpone. They might provide a non-committal response. They might just stop answering your email. And then that probably just means that that's a no. Because they wouldn't want to explicitly express that rejection right to the counterpart. Right, and for during the negotiation process, the question and the answer interchange, right, the exchange of information. Data has shown that for high context negotiators, they probably are more used to the type of style that they infer counterparty's preference from their conversation or from offers and counter offers. So if they are less likely to budge on a particular issue, then they're indicating that that issue is more important to them. But if you ask them which issue is more important, they wouldn't tell you. So inference is a very important skill when we deal with high context culture members.
What has surprised you most in your research, in your findings?
Two broad domain of findings. Number one is Linda Putnam's study and research on how to translate power and rights conversation into the focus on interest. So that ties to the tit-for-tat negotiation strategy. So in order to maximize our pie, we say that if we want to be distributive, it is important that we remember, okay, when making concession, when exchange information, we need to use tit-for-tat. That is, we match our counterparts' behavior, right? So we reward their cooperative behavior and we punish their competitive behavior. But then comes the problem. If the counterparty is competitive, then you are competitive, and they respond by competitive, and then conflict will continue to escalate. So where would be the stopping point, right? So their research was fascinating to me in the sense that they looked at, what kind of conversation will drag the conversation of power and the rights. So power is like, my company is bigger. I can sue you. I can spread word on social media so that everybody knows that you violated our contract. You're not ethical. So these are power, right? And the rights is that this is written in the contract. I think I'm entitled to do this and do that. But whether we should reciprocate when counterparty is threatening you with those power and the rights comments, and yes or no, right? But if you don't respond, that violates the tit-for-tat rule. But if you respond, the conflict would escalate, right? Then I'll sue you, you sue me, you threat me, I threat you, then it's a matter of who chickens out in the end, right? So her research indicates that, yes, we need to reciprocate. However, we also need to label this process as invalid. So I can sue you, you can also sue me. You can spread word, I can also spread word. Right? You are a large company. I think your reputation will be on the line if we do that as well. But it is not going to help us to reach the deal. So label the process as useless, as not helpful, and then pull the conversation back into, let's discuss what is really our concerns. What is the interest behind what you're asking for? And here is what is our interest behind it. So let's talk about the interest, the concerns, and hopefully we can really reach a deal.
All right.
And then that would be the way to go when you are dealing with someone who is, particularly have high bargaining power and who have those power to threat you, right? So I think that's very, very interesting to me. And then the other line of, I wouldn't say that's a particular line of research, but that is an important perspective of negotiation that's built on different research. That is, negotiation is not just one thing or one domain. It actually involves 3 domains. Well, I think it varies in terminologies, but the first would be the substance. The second would be relationship or people. The third would be the process. So, and we need to negotiate all these 3 domains separately.
I understand people, I understand the process. What would be the substance?
Substance.
The subject.
I think what you think, what you have in mind for process probably is what I refer to as substance. That is offer and counteroffer, all the agendas that we need to negotiate. These are the substance. Right? So what is the price? What is the delivery date? What is the terms for after sales? And then what about future collaborations? And so on. So these are substance. And then people, drawing from the seminal book of Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher, William Ury, and Bruce Patton. And then they said that very importantly, we need to separate people from the problem. Okay, so we need to deal with people separately. So how do we deal with people separately? 3 domains: emotion, perception, and the communication. So if there is emotion, so if I'm really angry, or if I perceive that you are really angry, what I should do is I need to deal with that emotion rather than forge on and continue to negotiate with you. So if I do that, I've mixed emotion with the substance. Okay, so one way to deal with emotion would be I want to calm down myself. I maybe step out, invite our secondary lead negotiators to, take my place and continue negotiate, or maybe we call a break. And then for my counterpart, if he or she is very angry, then I probably would consider just let them vent or call a break instead of just continue talking.
I got it.
Another idea related to this is we separate people from problem or separate relationship from substance. Means that we cannot hold relationship hostage to get what we want from the substance, and we don't need to do that anymore. If we are able to deal with people separately from the substance, then we don't have to worry that if I need to make a concession on this particular issue because I still want to be your friend. Or if because you are my friend, so I will have to tell you my bottom line, right? So we don't need to do that anymore. So we need to separate that. And then negotiation about the process is yet another domain that is very important, right? At which location, at what venue, who gets to give the opening offer, what is the size of the table, is media allowed, is the process confidential, and who gets to write the first draft of the proposal, who are the parties who will ratify the proposal, and how do we involve them? If there are multiple parties involved, do we all negotiate in one room? Or we set different tracks to negotiate? And who are the negotiators in each team? Who are allowed to be at the table, right? So all of these are process-wise. So if we don't have a deal, how do we continue our interaction or communication in the future, right? So these are the process. So the process oftentimes happens before negotiating the substance, and then dealing with substance and the people separately. So that is a very, very fundamental idea that I have drawn from the research and from negotiation work, and I think that that's an important message to know.
Well, it's fascinating. I don't think they taught it at Harvard. At the course that I took, at least.
Maybe in other courses.
In terms of culture, how does culture influence our reading of body language or reading of the tone voice?
To begin with, Paul Ekman, who has done fascinating works on emotion and the nonverbal cues and the micro expressions, he has identified the universal expressions.
Correct.
So there are expressions that works across the board. However, our culture, different cultural values actually affected how people express emotion and display emotion. So we can use, let's say, self-construal as one dimension for cultural difference. So the way you define yourself, who you are. Those people who define themselves as independent self-construal, that is, I am an autonomous entity. So the way I see myself is disconnected with other role relationships. So this is who I am. And then my definition from myself comes from within, my dispositions, my attributes, my emotions, my desires. In comparison, those people who are interdependent self-construal, they see themselves as interdependent. Means that when they define for themselves, they see they're connected, always connected with some kind of role relationship. For example, if you ask them to define for themselves, those people who are independent self-construal, okay, so they would say that I am, for example, I'm a professor, I am interested in negotiation, I love music, I do sports, so it's all about themselves. I'm not saying that they are self-centered, but it's just that they think that they are autonomous and then disconnected. However, those people who define themselves as interdependent self-construal, they might say that I am a daughter, I am a sister, I'm a mother, I'm a member of so-and-so club, committee, or I am a staff in Hong Kong U. So these are the way we see ourselves. And then those perceptions give rise to our behaviors. So if those people who are interdependent, then they have greater concern about the way those people in their role relationships view them. So a lot of their behaviors are driven by role obligations. this is who I am. This is what I'm supposed to do. If I'm a sister, I need to do this. If I'm a friend, I need to, be supportive and provide emotional accompany. I need to do this and do that, right? If I'm a boss, I need to maybe take care of my subordinates, and then if I'm a subordinate, I need to support so a lot of role obligations to define their behavior. In comparison, independent self-control individuals, they tend to be more, they're free from those constraints. So their emotion, their behavior comes from within. So it has been observed that interdependent self-control individuals tend to be more restrained in terms of expressing their emotions.
Okay, interdependent.
Interdependent, as compared to independent self-control individuals. So they are, the uniqueness of the self is encouraged for those people. So successful is, and it is great. I mean, they don't feel any constraint in expressing their uniqueness and their special, achievements and success. So linked to that, their emotion tends to be more exaggerated in terms of expression. And then for interdependent individuals, and then those self-control kind of individuals, then they are less willing to express their emotion. And cultural-wise, might consider it as not mature if they express their emotion, because that might break the harmony of their relationship, which they have obligation to keep for the relationship.
So then you would relink these two types into different cultures.
Yeah, so comparison, China overall has been more along the line, with more individuals that have interdependent self-controls. Therefore, the way they express their emotions is not that outspoken.
Okay.
So, which is why we see many negotiators complain that, when they negotiate with Chinese negotiators, they see poker face. They don't see emotions because they don't express them, right? That happens on negotiation table, but in daily lives, if you really compare, across cultures, you will also see a big difference in terms of how freely they express facially their expression. So when you're on the negotiation table, oftentimes one of the cues that we get is to observe their facial expressions, right? That if you don't see much clues, you won't be able to see whether they're happy or not, then that probably will make it more difficult to negotiate.
What's the one thing that people should stop doing immediately in order to avoid misunderstanding in cross-cultural negotiations?
I think negotiators need to really hold their judgment when negotiating with those people who come from different cultures. Getting back to the separate people from problem, that's the perception part that we need to deal with. Oftentimes, we ignore perception differences, and we hold the assumption that everybody sees the world as we do, or everybody at the table see those agenda or those issues to be discussed just as we do. However, oftentimes that's not the case. Not to mention when the counterparty come from different cultural background. So there are a lot of incidents on negotiation tables where negotiators perceive one particular issue as not important, whereas it actually is highly valued by their counterpart. But by brushing it off on the negotiation table, they might offend their counterpart because they might think that you don't want to talk about it. However, that really is not the case. Yet, without discussing that perception, then parties will, just continue their negotiation based on their misunderstanding of each other, and then which might produce roadblocks in future negotiations and future sessions. So that is very important. The DEA, they have different terminology, but DEA models, description, evaluation, analysis, or description, evaluation, and the interpretation model differentiated how do we see and comment on a situation. So negotiators dealing with different negotiated with different cultural background, I think it is very important for us to focus on the objective facts and then use language that are descriptive rather than adding our interpretations or analysis. For example, if you raised your voice, right? So if I asked, why did you raise your voice? I'm describing the fact, an objective fact, right? But if I analyze, are you angry? Then this is based on my cultural upbringings, my own perception, my own understanding. So you raise your voice, then I interpret that you are angry. Or, worse off if I just sneakily think that you are so rude by raising voice, right? Because people in our culture don't talk like that. On our negotiation tables for this kind of issue, there's no need to raise voice. Then I would think you are so rude, or you're not professional, you're not respectful, without outspokenly say it, right? But that is analysis, or that is evaluation. So we need to hold on to those interpretation and evaluation, and discuss. This is what I see, and this is what hasn't been done, and this is what happened to the project. Rather than saying, you haven't done this well, you didn't do this, that up to the standard. You are so rude, and you're aggressive, right? So I think across culturally on the negotiation table, this is particularly important.
So those two things, right? One was
hold judgment, discuss perception. Well, let's put it this way: hold judgment, and then focus more on the objective facts. I actually would like to add one more thing.
Go ahead.
So also important is just tie back to, I want to repeat that, is don't negotiate when you are angry or when the counterparty is angry. Don't negotiate unless you are able to really control your emotions so that you can use anger to your favor in a conscious way. Otherwise, definitely separate the emotion from the substance.
If you could teach me one thing about conflict management in negotiations, what would it be?
Only one thing.
The most important thing.
The most important thing. Understand your BATNA. You know it, right? BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That is, if you don't have a deal with the counterpart, what is your next alternative? This is super, super important. BATNA gives us bargaining power in the current negotiation, right? When you don't have another option, you don't know when to leave table in the current negotiation. So BATNA help us to calculate our bottom line in the current negotiation. I'm not saying that this is a direct quantification of the BATNA, our reservation price or the bottom line, but it is a very important indicator of, or the base or factor for computing our bottom line or reservation price in the current negotiation, and then decide when you need to leave the current negotiator.
Some might say, I don't want BATNA, I want what I want. I want to get what I want. What's your view on that?
I would say that view have mixed people or a mixed relationship with substance in the emotion part. Because this is your passion and this is your goal and you really love this, maybe client or school or house or company or job, whatever it is. You love it and you're committed to get it, but that is your emotion. But if you are rational, you need to stay in a deal if it is better than your alternative, and then leave a deal if it is worse than your alternative.
Okay.
So knowing a BATNA, then you will be more rational in the negotiation to have your emotion in check. So passion is very important. But if we're talking about negotiation, you want it to be effective. You don't want to leave table prematurely, and then you also don't want to agree to a deal that's worse than your alternative.
To what extent can we rely on rationality when we are talking about humans? Because we are not rational creatures.
Right. In negotiation in particular, people do mix negotiation substance with their emotion. And one particular important point is when we factor fairness or perceived fairness into the equation. right?
Okay.
So a lot of people, we see a lot of negotiators leave table just because they don't think it's fair in terms of the pie distribution. They already have an alternative, and the deal they are having is better than their alternative, but they still choose to leave because they don't think it is fair, right? We choose to leave a company because we don't think we are fairly treated. We probably don't even have a better option. That happens a lot. But it doesn't mean that we should not have a partner to keep us in check in terms of the way we negotiate, to enhance our size of the pie, and then to be more professional as a negotiator.
What are typical habits or assumptions one should prepare for when negotiating in China?
One thing very important is to understand the high context culture communication style. Particularly if negotiators come from low context cultures who communicate in a more direct way. So you probably should not expect direct answers to a lot of questions that you ask. You probably will need to try to make an inference from a lot of conversations. You know, other people might like it, probably means I don't like it, right? I'm not doing this. You see your employees not doing certain tasks, probably because they have some roadblocks and they have some constraints that they didn't tell you. So we need to be aware of the things that are unsaid. That is very important. And given the interdependent self-control of a lot of individuals as a cultural syndrome, we need to expect the importance of relationship and the transitive relationship and the role obligations. So, for those people who are high in interdependent self-control, they tend to have higher level of obligation to their role fulfillment. So as a friend, they have their role obligations to fulfill as well. Therefore, if you are not familiar with the counterpart, it is really important to find a key contact. Find someone who are in good term with them, with the culture, know the language, know the stakeholders very well. Then they will be extremely important in negotiating a lot of difficult issues.
Could you tell me how or if the Chinese philosophy or Chinese ancient texts influence the negotiation styles of the Chinese people?
I would draw to two things. Number one is overall Confucianism gave rise to the holistic thinking style overall of East Asian culture. The key characteristics of the holistic thinking style is really pay attention to the context as opposed to isolating the object and then make sense of it. Okay, so it's more field dependent. So I need to understand your role in the society, your role in the structure, in the hierarchy, for me to make sense of you, of who you are, rather than solely relying on who you are as an individual. So your attributes, your hobbies, your dispositions, that's not enough. So a general attention to the field and then to the context is one very typical holistic thinking style characteristics. And the other is the try to connect it to the first one. Pay attention to the relationship, the connection between the different objects, different people. So that is very deep rooted. So with that in mind, then we know that different stakeholders and the relationships really is important when it comes to negotiation and then to achieve certain goals. And then the other piece of work is the art of war. Art of war actually have included a lot of negotiation wisdom. And also because a lot of negotiators would consider negotiation as a war or as a game, as a sports game. And then, to overestimate the zero-sum feature of that and underestimate the amount of commonalities that happens between the negotiators. Therefore, with that mentality, a lot of people just want to win. Or they assume that if I don't win, then you would win. Or in the worst case, nobody wins. And then that kind of mentality for negotiation is very common. Therefore, drawing to art of war is a lot of what negotiators would do if they would like to study negotiation. They would like to learn what are the strategies, what are the tactics that could be done. So I think that is influential as well. So art of war talk about the importance of knowing you yourself and the importance of knowing your counterpart. And 知己知彼，百战不殆. So know yourself and then know your counterparty. You can win 100 wars, right? And it talked about the importance of preparations, the importance of not making mistakes, right? So it says that the very important thing to remember is that you win by not making mistakes. Okay. When both parties are very strong, then the one who loses will be the one who makes mistakes, right? And it talks about the importance of controlling emotions. It talks about how impulsive decisions would generate irrevocable tragedy, to remind everybody that the damage of emotional outburst, or to negotiate when you are in a high emotional states. So a lot of things that has been, that's related to negotiation has been well illustrated in the book.
So to anybody who didn't read the book, is it an easy read, or do they have to read in between the lines in order to grasp the idea of negotiations rather than just fighting the war, waging the war?
I think I would recommend purchasing or read the version with interpretations and explanations.
Do you have your own negotiation strategy?
To me, a combination of distributive negotiation, integrative negotiation, plus principled negotiation would be a perfect set.
Okay.
So negotiation is a mixed motive enterprise. We need to know how to be win-win, expand the pie, and also need to know within the pie, how do I go about to distribute the pie with my counterpart? And I also need to know, once I try to dig deep into each other's interests so that we can expand the pie, and then to find creative solutions or options that can fulfill both of our concerns and interests, what would be the objective criteria we can look to? So that I don't yield to you, you don't yield to me, we yield to an objective criteria. So this framework is not my framework. This is the framework that I really think is effective and useful. So I would like to adopt when it comes to negotiation. That draws from many negotiation research, and frameworks.
What next level tips or tricks do you use to prepare people for high-stake negotiations?
For high-stake negotiation is to treat it as multi-party negotiation. A lot of high-stake negotiations, sometimes appearing to be two-front or bilateral, actually involves many, many different stakeholders. So viewing important negotiations really as multi-party negotiation and to go from there is very important. And then the key, difference between multi-party from two-party, right, to bilateral, is the information exchange is more complicated. And then coalitions might happen. And then bad-to-ness is not stable anymore, because coalitions might happen along the way, and coalitions are not stable oftentimes. So your bad-to-ness changes along the way as well. So you need to think about how to build a winning coalition, how to prevent spoiler coalitions to happen. So all of these concerns evolved around, from the multi-party negotiation. So it's a different or more advanced set of skills as compared to two-party negotiation. for high-stake ones, it is important to remember, don't just look at these two parties. There ought to be many different stakeholders. Some are on the surface, very obvious. Some are not seen, that are behind the table. Really find out who they are and treat it as a multi-party one.
What is a small habit that you have cultivated that helps you negotiate better?
I would always treat an offer or counteroffer only as an illustration of an interest rather than a demand. So always dig deep into the interest behind the position. What you're asking for, what I am offering, these are all just examples of possible solutions that can fulfill our concerns. So I wouldn't treat the counterparties' offers and counteroffers as really demand or the only way that can fulfill their interest. Mm-hmm. So that will really help us to, restrain from confrontational exchange of what is okay, what is not okay to do, but use that as a platform to lead us into the world behind that. What exactly is what we wanted? What exactly is the interest? The interest behind the interest, what are they? So if we are not able to fulfill what you're asking for this particular offer, what are some other things we can do to help you achieve your goal? So this would be just an example.
So you would treat the initial offer as a illustration and a starting point to achieve more.
Yeah.
If you were writing a playbook for someone starting in negotiations, what would the first chapter be about?
I would really, number one, talk about negotiation is a mixed motive enterprise.
Mixed motive.
Mixed motive.
Uh-huh.
It is not just cooperative. It is not just competitive. It is cooperative and it is competitive. So we need to really look at both sides of the story and also learn both sets of strategies and use it in as an integral part of negotiation.
Never split a difference. You probably have read the book.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? Because you are talking about collaboration, cooperation, sharing the pie, but then, as Chris Voss says, don't do it, don't compromise, just get what you want.
You don't have to compromise on positions. You don't have to compromise. We can find many other options that we don't need to give in on what we cannot do or our important. We don't have to give in on our interest in order to fulfill counterparties' needs or interest. So all the positions, again, are illustrations. So we don't have to give in on those. So I can tell you, I cannot let go on this price. But if I introduce more issues to the table, maybe price wouldn't be so important to you anymore, because I've built priorities. So then you can let go on price. Then I can let you have something else, maybe future order for another, let's say, another area of the Greater China, right? So you can have more orders in the future, then I don't have to compromise on my position.
And so basically, in order to minimize the obstacle, you build up a set of different priorities which may go beyond.
Build up priorities, adding more issues, unbundle the issues, break it down into smaller issues to talk about, to create priorities, to hopefully find compatible priorities, so that I can let go on those issues that are not important for me, and to fulfill the most important issue for you, and the vice versa, likewise.
Referring back to Chris Voss, he teaches negotiations by providing sentences or very practical strategies. Do you also do that in your classes when you teach negotiations, or do you just talk about frameworks and theories?
Overall, I would introduce the building blocks and then the two important perspectives, the two important approach. One is distributive, the other is integrative, which is to expand the pie. And when we do various negotiation simulations, then we will talk about, what would be more effective to, for example, generate more information exchange about the interest behind the position. We might talk about how to open the opening offer would be a reasonably high opening offer, right? For example, you need to open reasonably high. What is reasonably high, right? If you are able to just aim as high as possible, but you need to finish that sentence, right? So I want this because if you're able to justify for it, then that would be safer as compared to you just start with an extremely high offer, which will be very easily debunked by your counterpart. Asking open questions, and then to asking questions about, I understand that you really would like to have this. Is there anything else we can do that can help you also fulfill your need, right? And we talked about one way to get the negotiators past the dispute and move on to future interaction. That comes from a lot of my students' negotiation performance. And I have noticed that one kind of statement is particularly helpful of moving negotiation on. That actually has been documented by different negotiation authors and the researchers. But so what they have said is that, now assume or let's suppose that this could be addressed this way. Would you consider that? So to generate options without committing to it, with nobody committing to it. So let's just discuss the option. Rather than say, you have to compensate me. Without compensation, I'm not going to talk about the future deals, right? So we have to resolve this dispute first before we can do anything else. But one way that has been, I have observed in my students, I have observed, I also know that a lot of researchers have mentioned that, is really just to talk about, what if we do this? What if we say, you give me this, I made this compensation. What might happen in our future? To get people move on to the future interaction.
All right, so it calms people down and lets them move on.
So that we can downplay the conflict and the dispute at the moment, and then to guide both parties to look forward. And then the best way to reach a deal is to look forward, right? To look at the future is the best way to get the past taken care of.
If you could design a challenge for anybody who wants to be better at negotiations, something that they could do every day when talking to people or interacting with others, what would this challenge be?
Listening. Listen.
How? I mean, everybody listens every day. I do. You do.
Just because for negotiators, if we see our counterpart as our opponent, we have this instinct of being reactive, devaluating. It is reactive because we want to make sure that we are at the upper hand. Devaluation means I don't want to give credit to what you say. So one thing to remember is, to practice maybe. Whenever there is a conflict, there is a difference, there's a disagreement, you're on a negotiation table. When a counterparty is saying something, practice that really try to figure out what they really means. Through the lens of maybe shouting, yelling, maybe offensive remarks, maybe rambling on because they don't know what they're talking about, through a lot of blurry the screen. Through that screen, try to listen to what is really going on. What is it that they really want? So we can do that first by really suppress your impulse of reactive devaluation. Number two is try to ask questions, paraphrase, and then check whether your understanding was correct.
Okay.
Right? I heard what you said this. My understanding is that really what you are thinking about? Is that really the case? So really comment on what you have heard and what you understand, and ask them and try to pay attention to what really is going on, rather than just what they are expressing.
What is the most important skill that you think of in negotiations?
I think it's a collection.
It is.
It is a collection of skills. On one hand, you need to really understand all the building blocks of negotiation. On the other hand, is to dig deep into the interest behind the positions. I think one very important skill is really be able to understand your counterpart, to know people, to pay attention to their verbal and nonverbal cues, and to understand the interest of the counterpart. If it's a group of people, what is their individual interest? What is the collective interest? Is the interest amongst themselves consistent, unanimous, or they have their different agenda? And then is their interest the same as their back table, the company? And how do you find that out? So that requires some people skill. So we need to find a way to really understand those. And then when they talk, we observe not just their nonverbal cues, but their facial expressions, their emotions, and their colleagues, their teammates' nonverbal cues, and their reactions. So I think those negotiators who are very good at observing those cues and then knowing how to get to know people and know their interest will be at an advantage.
Would you confirm that it's always better to have a negotiation team composed of more than one person so that the other person can look at the others?
I definitely would suggest that we have a team as a negotiator, so that negotiators have different roles and functions during the process, because negotiation is very stressful, and then it is easy, it is really easy to make mistakes or say something that we regret.
Okay.
So if we have a team, then, for example, we will be able to decide who will do more observation and then contribute to the suggestion of strategies, who will do the negotiation, give offer and counter offers, and then who will be the secondary negotiators, who will be the decision makers. Better yet, the decision makers do not negotiate, because it is difficult for the decision makers to be the negotiators. I mean, two roles in one person. It's very hard. But if we don't have that luxury, sometimes you have to be your own negotiator and the decision maker and observer, then we just have to do it.
Grace, it was a fascinating journey. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. I had a great time.